Let's talk about how a column still works. Prepare yourself. 1830, Aeneas Coffey patented what is the most closely aligned with the modern column still. He was predated by Robert Stein, who came up with a column still variation before him, and he improved upon it basically. But that's the version that was closest to sort of what we now use as a column still in whiskey and spirits distillation. And here's how it works. It's a column, end of video. No, I'm just kidding. It's a column. It can be various diameters. It doesn't changes things, but for our purposes, let's say it's about as big around as this barrel top for a big commercial distillery, and it can be anywhere from 10 to 80 feet tall, and it's got plates. And the more plates, the cleaner the spirit, the higher the proof comes out towards the top. The way it works is, in a plate, by a plate I mean it's a piece of usually copper or stainless steel, but usually copper, and it's perforated so that it can allow liquid to fall down and vapor to go up. That's the shortest version of it. And you heat up your beer or your wash, your distiller's beer or wash, and so you got like an 8 or 10% alcohol, and it gets fed in through a pipe to roughly halfway up the column. And as it gets poured in, it just falls down through the plates and collects at the bottom. As that's happening, you feed steam through the bottom of the column, and steam rises through the column. And as that steam hits the wash, it volatilizes. It's a weird word. It makes volatile. The ethanol molecules and like fusel oils and all these different chemical structures get vaporized, basically, and they attach to the steam. The steam carries them up, and then it hits a plate. And a plate is a little cooler than the steam, and so it condenses and falls back down. And then it gets brought back up again, and as it gets lighter, it makes it through that plate and into the next one. And it just continues this process, feeding itself through a plate, hitting the next one, condensing, falling back down. So when you first start, you'll see it like build up one section at a time until the entire column, each plate has activity going on. And the higher and the more plates, the more that it strips heavier chemical structures out, and the more it retains the ethanol and the lighter chemicals. And so the practical impact is that it strips, as whiskey nerds will say, it strips out flavor, but it depends on how high you go. This is one of the only ways to make vodka. Pot still vodka is a pain in the butt, and the loss is astronomical. It's just a waste of money. But in a column, you can just keep feeding beer in, and then basically what happens is as this vapor goes up and up and up and up, and it gets stripped and higher, and the proof goes up, and it gets cleaner, at a certain point you have a valve, and usually you have a lot of valves, so you can choose where to pull. And all that vapor just goes, oh, and out. And then it gets condensed. Now, if you're just column distilling, then that it just gets condensed straight into a spirit, and it's a pretty even proof, and so on. If you go all the way to the top, then you get vodka. And if you go kind of low, then what happens in a lot of commercial bourbon distilleries in Kentucky and elsewhere is they'll take that beer, and their mind, our only goal of this wash is to get the most alcohol out of it that we can before we run it through a pot still and make cuts. And so they'll do a combination of what's called a column still and a doubler. And a doubler is basically the spirit still, pot still. And so you run it through a column, and you don't run near as high as you would for vodka or anything like that. And you bring it off, and then you run it in effectively a pot still, and you make cuts. And that's a lot of bourbon. Now, in Scotland, they tend to run their column stills much higher than in like Kentucky bourbon, and just below vodka, really. And in America, we do the same thing. We call it light whiskey. In Scotland, they call it grain whiskey. And then we're going to come back to that. So this is Johnnie Walker High Rye. This is a blended Scotch whiskey, which means it starts with a grain and adds malt for flavor. And we're talking about grain whiskey. It belongs evidently in the family of Johnnie Walker Black lines, and so it uses the same sort of malt components that go into the Johnnie Walker Black, which is like, Glenkinchie, Cardew, Coolila for the smoke, and so on. And often the grains, I think Cameron Bridge and Taninic, I think, don't hold me to that. But they call this rye. Why do they call it rye? Did they put rye whiskey into it? Yes, legally. But as an American, did they put what Americans consider rye whiskey into it? No, not really. So, what's the nose? Oh, it's actually got kind of a softness to it. I was looking for something a little sharper, maybe because I'm trying to remember Johnnie Walker blends. Also, if you hear a humming in the background, I forgot to say this earlier, we got construction going on campus. For the next few videos, you might hear it on my microphone. Okay. There's that light cream, berries and cream. A little bit of ash is the wrong word, but it's there. It's sort of a hint of smokiness, but really gentle. Oh, that's, whoa, okay. That was a left field shift. It starts like, oh, that's nice. Whoa, what's that? It starts in the direction of the classic Johnnie Walker Black with this nice berries and richness and malty depth, and then gets a little thin because of the grain and slightly vanillined and sugared, and then kind of a metallic smoke towards the end. But somewhere about 3/4 of the way through on this one, it totally switches gears to this strangely prickly spice, which is going to take some getting used to. I'm going to say I like it, but I'm also going to say I don't understand it yet. I'm going to need to live with this one. I'm not going to add water. It's already 45, just because I want to keep experiencing that while I talk, and maybe my brain will latch onto some things that I'm not picking up right now. It's nice. I prefer the Johnnie Walker Black, but it's got this new layer of prickly spice that is not in the other one. Not enough to become fully rye whiskey. So if you're an American rye drinker, not your territory. It's a sort of a general hat nod from thousands of miles away in the direction of rye. Okay, so this way of distilling whiskey on a column shows up in the 1800s, right? And for 80 years, it's the norm of like, people are making whiskey like that because it's way more efficient because, as I said, you pump in wash and then you just feed out spirit, right? Well, as long as you can keep pumping in wash, you can feed out spirit. That's why it's called continuous distillation. Whereas a pot, you have to fill it, distill, dump, clean, fill, distill, dump, clean, fill. That's a lot of cycling. On a column still, you can just feed it 24/7. As long as you've got wash to put into it, that can keep running. And I can't remember the math on it, but the amount of whiskey that a column still can put out in a week compared to a pot still distillery is astronomical. It's not even degrees. It's a massive, explosive leap. And so what happened was all these big budget whiskey makers who were making sort of the cheap stuff and not the malt pot still guys started just pumping out whiskey on these things and flooding the market. And for about 80 years, there was a battle about whether or not that's whiskey. Because it sure doesn't taste like pot still whiskey at all. But is it made from grain? Yes. Is it put in barrels and aged? Yes. Is it whiskey? The malt guys didn't think so, but the guys making the grain whiskey did. And so what happens is it results in a point in 1909 where a royal commission is put in to decide once and for all, is this whiskey or not whiskey? And what they ruled was, yes, it's whiskey, but you have to call it grain whiskey. And from that day forward, there's a split between malt and grain whiskey. Now, I'm going to clarify that because when you say grain whiskey, you don't mean whiskey made from grain, because malt is grain and malt is pot still, right? When Scotland and Ireland and Canada, when they say grain whiskey, what they mean is column distillation. That's what they mean. And so when they say this is a blended Scotch, that's a mix of grain whiskey and malt whiskey, column distillation and pot distillation, right? Now in Scotland, malt has to be barley, so the pot still is always running barley. There's some exceptions to that in the small layers right now, but when they say grain whiskey, they just mean any grain in a column. Now, historically, they used the cheapest grain they could get their hands on, which was a commodity grain, so corn or wheat. Not normally barley, because normally barley is way more expensive. And so if you get barley, you're going to use it for malt distillation, not for column distillation, because you're not really looking for strong flavor. You're just looking for a base whiskey that you're going to use to add flavor to with malts later on, right? I looked everywhere I could find, and I can't tell if this is what's happening, but it seems like the rye component is a grain whiskey in this. And so they ran it through a column still. That makes it grain whiskey, but instead of using wheat or corn, they used rye grain. Now, does that impact the flavor because you've distilled it so high and stripped most of the real flavor components out? Yeah, absolutely. If you've ever tried single grain whiskey, which is one distillery's grain product, and you've tried grain whiskey that was corn or grain whiskey that was wheat, you can tell. Even in America with light whiskey, you can tell the base grain. And so, is a grain whiskey using rye going to taste different? Yeah, absolutely. Does it play well with malt? I don't know. Is it interesting? Yeah, it's very interesting. But I don't know that I would crave it. It definitely feels like, I can't believe this image just popped into my head. But remember when Michael Jordan played baseball for a while? And he was fine, even good. But he wasn't like world-class, all-star, best of all baseball player like he was basketball player, right? And it feels a little bit like this grain is doing a decent job in the wrong sport. Now, it is different and a very interesting A-B comparison. And if you really love rye, you might find a lot here to like. You know me, I like rye, but I don't love rye. And so finding rye in my blended Scotch feels a little bit like an unwelcome surprise. Or like biting into a chocolate chip cookie and discovering it's actually oatmeal raisin. Whoops. Anyway, it's interesting, and I hope that that helps you understand column distillation a little bit better. It's a very simplified version of it, but it should give you at least a A-B comparison. And I'm really glad you're here. Cheers.